Hillcrest Church video. We hope this message will help you grow.
Get to be part of. My name's Tim. I want to say welcome to you this morning on this, what are we now, third Sunday of Advent? Wow, third Sunday of Advent. And Advent comes from the Latin adventus, which means arrival. And Advent, it's the season where followers of Jesus, we set time aside to look back on the first arrival of Jesus at Christmas. And then also, and this doesn't get emphasized as much, but it's important to look ahead at the second arrival of Jesus, when he will make all things well in the final, the end of history when Jesus returns. And so this Advent season, what we've been doing is, during the fall, we did this long teaching series called The Big Story of the Bible. And we worked through Genesis through Revelation, kind of laying out how this sacred library works together to describe God's true story of all things. And if you weren't here for that and you're interested in it, the videos of the teachings are online. We also have these summary statements of everything we worked through. If that would be helpful, you want to catch up, it's all available on the website. But as we move to Advent, we recognize that it was a pretty heady kind of intellectual series, these ideas about how the scriptural story works. And this Advent, we've tried to slow down and talk about that there's this shift that needs to take place where it goes from ideas in our heads to realities in our hearts that we live out of. I think we all can recognize that we know for ourselves and other people it's possible to have ideas in our heads that aren't actually lived realities. And so this Advent we've been talking about, what does it mean to live out of the biblical story, to see our lives within the biblical story, to indwell it, to have it shape our imagination, how we imagine reality around us, that this is kind of the place that our hearts occupy is out of this story. And that particularly at Advent, there are these classic Advent words: peace, hope, love, joy. You've probably seen them in all sorts of adverts all around this time of year. And what does it mean for them not just to be words on a page, but actually experienced realities? And we think that as we indwell this story and encounter the God of the story, the love, peace, hope, and joy actually become more and more lived realities. So this is what we've been talking about. And today, last week Christian talked about hope. Today I would like to focus on, or last week Christian talked about peace. Today I'd like to focus on hope. And particularly maybe this opposite of hope, that sometimes we feel cynicism. So when I think about Christmas and hope, the idea that comes to my mind is that sometimes around Christmas, there can be a gap that opens up between kind of how we perceive Christmas in all its happiness and twinkling lights and family reuniting and the felt reality of our lives. So for myself, 2008, Christmas 2008, for me, worst Christmas ever. And my wife and I, Christy and I, we had just finished this season of living in Aurora, Colorado. And I'd been, for 5 years, I spent trying to build up this ministry to young adults, this church within a church, and really ended the season feeling like I failed. Christy was in a counseling practice, and the person who led the counseling practice that fall, he left his wife, ran off with another woman. And then so we're closing things down, and then we're leaving our life in Aurora, Colorado. We're going to go live in Jerusalem to study for a season. But before we do that, we're going to spend Christmas with my family in Colorado Springs. And my dad had been having abdominal pain for a while leading up to this. And so he had some tests and stuff. So December 24th, the morning of December 24th, the doctor calls and says, hey, the MRI came back, and you have a tumor the size of a baseball in your abdomen. And I'm like, thanks for ruining Christmas, Cancer. Like, and so, that night, I remember going to their church in Colorado Springs, going to the Christmas Eve worship service, and this gap opening up between, Silent Night, no crying he makes, and let's drive and look at the Christmas lights, and look at the kids in the nativity, like between this kind of real, like this perception of all should be happy, and I feel like my life in Colorado unraveled, and I don't know if my dad's going to be alive in a year. And there felt this distance between the way I perceive Christmas and the reality of my life. And I wonder if you've felt that gap before. And I think about that year, the season out of that. And for me, something shifted inside of me around Christmas and hope that year. My dad, he had treatment, and the cancer went into remission. And thankfully, to this day, the cancer hasn't come back. And so it didn't end by taking his life. And yet, for me, there's a kind of naivete that fell off me through this process, because I recognized that for my dad, there was no guarantee it would turn out that way. I've known plenty of followers of Jesus who, for themselves and for the people they love, it didn't end up with a happy ending. And so there's just this recognition of there's no guarantee. Like, just following Jesus doesn't mean there's this guarantee that ministry is going to feel successful, or the people around me will make decisions of integrity, or that I and the ones that I love will be physically safe and well all the time. And there was this, just genuine naivete that fell away from me in this time. What does it mean to hope in the God who showed up in Christmas in light of these things? And I wonder if you've felt that gap at times. I wonder if you've at times come to a Christmas where it's like, man, the way I'm, this kind of shiny, happy Christmas doesn't seem to be lining up with the reality of my life right now. And so I would just take a second and think to yourself, when have you felt that gap? What are times or places that you've felt that gap? And I want to talk about that. I want to talk about that gap today. And what does it mean to have a biblical hope in light of the reality of our lives? The passage I want to look at today comes from 2 Corinthians, and I'm going to read from chapter 1. First, I'm going to read a little thing from chapter 11, and then we're going to spend some time in chapter 1. But this is a letter written by, his name's Paul. He was a leader in the Jesus movement. And after Jesus' resurrection and ascension to heaven, Paul went around starting these Jesus communities, these kingdom outposts in the towns and villages throughout the Mediterranean world. And so he was going around to these places and announcing that there is this crucified Jewish carpenter who's actually the king of the world and makes a way back to knowing God. And lo and behold, people started trusting in this Jesus, and it started changing their lives. These little kingdom communities were starting. And Paul's going around doing this work, and yet it was incredibly difficult. So this is Paul, just to get a sense for the difficulty that he faced. Here, Paul's talking about his work in chapter 11. He says, 5 times I received from the Jews 40 lashes minus 1. Essentially, it's a whipping, 39 lashes. 5 times he says that happens. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was pelted with stones. 3 times I was shipwrecked. I spent a night and a day in the open sea. I've been constantly on the move. I've been in danger from rivers, in danger from bandits, in danger from my fellow Jews, in danger from Gentiles, in danger in the city, in danger in the country, in danger at sea, and in danger from false believers. I have labored and toiled, and have often gone without sleep. I have known hunger and thirst, and have often gone without food. I have been cold and naked, and beside everything else, I face daily the pressure of my concern for all the churches, all these kingdom communities. And so I just want to make the observation that for the writers, like he's a real human being who was following Jesus. For the writers of these texts, they were not naive about the fact that following Jesus can involve real emotional and physical suffering. Paul writes, he's deeply aware of that. And then I want to jump back now to chapter 1 because he speaks about a specific situation that was difficult for him and his hope out of it. So in chapter 1 of the same letter, verse 8, he's talking about a specific situation. He says, "We do not want you to be uninformed, brothers and sisters, about the troubles we experienced in the province of Asia. We were under great pressure, far beyond our ability to endure." Paul doesn't say, God won't give you anything you can't handle. He says, actually, I ended up in a situation where I absolutely could not handle it. So that we despaired of life itself. Indeed, we felt we'd received the sentence of death. See, for Paul, this follower of Jesus, these experiences of being in a situation beyond your ability to endure, of despair unto life itself, feeling like you had received a death sentence. This, Paul says, could be part of a Jesus follower's experience as well. That commitment to Jesus doesn't mean you get out of these kinds of life experiences. But in the midst of it, there's a certain kind of biblical hope. Paul goes on. He says, "But this happened, that we might not rely on ourselves, but on God, who raises the dead. He has delivered us from such a deadly peril, and He will deliver us again. On Him we have set our hope, that He will continue to deliver us. As you help us by your prayers, then many will give thanks on our behalf for the gracious favor granted us in answer to the prayers of many." Paul says that he places his hope on Him. His hope is on Him, the God who raises the dead. This is where his hope to be delivered comes from. And for Paul, you need to understand that when he says, "This God delivers me, this God rescues me," Paul isn't saying, "I know that it's always going to end up sweet and easy." That's not what Paul is saying. Like, Paul's already talked about all this real emotional and physical suffering that he's gone through. He's been very honest about that. And so, yes, Paul hopes in the one who raises the dead. Sometimes Paul recognizes, sometimes that means God delivers me out of a situation. He changes the circumstances. Thanks be to God. Sometimes Paul knows that means He changes how we experience it. He doesn't change the circumstances, He changes our reality of it. Paul spent years in prison, and God delivered him as He changed Paul's experience of that prison. And Paul also knows that following Jesus doesn't mean a guarantee that your life will be protected for all, the 90 or 100 years you desire. Paul watched followers of Jesus be killed for following Jesus. Paul understood, he was very aware that that was a real possibility. Following Jesus doesn't mean this guarantee of physical protection. For Paul, his hope in the one who raises the dead was, in a sense, it was more uncertain and certain at the same time. It was uncertain in the sense of Paul's not saying, God guarantees that I know how the circumstances will all turn out. Paul doesn't know how all the circumstances will turn out, but he does know the one who holds all the circumstances in the end. Paul says, maybe God will change my circumstances, or maybe He will change my heart, or maybe this will end in my life being over, but even if that happens, I trust in a God who will bring me through death itself. Paul's not saying, I know how all the things will turn out. he's saying, I know the one who created all things and upholds all the things and stands at the end of all the things. And whatever happens, he will be with me and bring me out the other side. It's a focus less on the circumstances and more on the God who is with Paul in the circumstances. Paul's got this phrase in there. He says that he places his hope on him. On him we have set our hope. When I think about where we set our hope, I almost picture this physical hope, and where are we setting it down? He says, I don't set it on, he says, we don't rely on ourselves, because I think without trust in God, the only place we can put our hope is on ourselves, or maybe chance. Like if you just have kind of human optimism, then that is relying on our ability to control the future. Like human optimism is, I believe whatever happens, I'll figure out a way to get through it. And it puts tremendous pressure on oneself. Or you can say, human optimism is, I believe the dice of chance will fall in my favor. And it puts tremendous anxiety around how the dice of chance in our lives will roll out. Biblical hope is not focused on relying on us or relying on chance. Biblical hope is different. It's saying, I place my hope on God. And I know however the circumstances shake out, this God will be with me and will strengthen me and will bring me through, even if it gets darker than I can imagine. There's this shift of focus from circumstances to God. This shift of where our hope is set from ourselves and chance to the God who raises the dead. And I think there's this phrase in there that captures the shift of attention for me, that where his hope is set. He's got this phrase, he says, that his hope is on him. And earlier on he says, my hope is but on God who raises the dead. And this phrase, but God, it's a phrase, but God, happens over and over in the biblical story. It's a deeply biblical phrase, but God. It implies this life going along normally, but God steps in and does something for us. And I just wonder if it comes out of Paul indwelling and inhabiting and imagining this story. This phrase, but God, about where Paul's focus is. And you think about all the different times we read this phrase, but God, in Scripture. So, for example, in the Genesis 3, God creates the first man and woman. And God wants to be at harmony with them in the garden, but they rebel against God, and they say, God, we actually want to do things our own way. And they eat from the tree, and they invite death and evil into the world. But then there's this phrase in Genesis 3, it says, but God called to the man, where are you? In spite of their rebellion, but God comes looking for them. And then time passes in the biblical story, and things get so awful, like evil and immorality and injustice just build up a head of steam. And then in the story of Noah, God sends this flood of judgment on the world. And there's just this one family, Noah and the animals in the boat, and we read this phrase again, but God remembered Noah and all the wild animals. And then God calls Abram and Sarai and says, and through you and through your descendants, I will bless and heal the world. And they say, God, we don't have any kids. We are unable to have children. And then, but God gives them a child. The descendants of Abram and Sarai, the people of Israel, they end up enslaved in Egypt for 400 years. And then the phrase in the book of Deuteronomy to describe what happens is, but the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand. The people of Israel, they end up trafficking in idolatry and immorality and injustice, and God allows Assyria and Babylon to conquer them, and they go into exile. But God does not leave them there. They long for a coming Messiah, and they have these hopes, well, God will one day send a Messiah, but God sends the Messiah, Jesus of Nazareth. And then the same but God language starts getting applied to Jesus, that one day Jesus is walking through this village, and we're told that there's a child there who has some kind of like evil spirit influence. Somehow evil has gotten its hooks into this young boy. In the book of Mark, it says, even while the boy was coming, the demon threw him down to the ground. But Jesus rebuked the impure spirit and healed the boy and gave him back to the Father. One time, Jesus' apprentices, his disciples, are out in a boat at night, and it's late at night, and it's dark, and they're afraid, and Jesus comes walking out to them on the water, and they're terrified. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid." And then, in spite of all Jesus' goodness, he is betrayed, and he's executed, and he's buried in the ground. And then we read these biblical words, "But God raised him from the dead, freeing him from the agony of death, because it was impossible for death to keep its hold on him." And I just imagine Paul immersed in this biblical story of people facing all kinds of impossible situations and dark nights of the soul, and it not always turning out how they thought it would, but over and over again holding to this hope of, but there is a God who raises the dead. And so Paul, in the midst of his dark night, in the midst of the situation that was beyond his ability to endure, in the midst of the place where he despaired unto life itself, he held to, but there is a God who raises the dead, and on him I place my hope, not on myself, not on the roll of the dice of chance, on this God who will bring me through, even though I don't know how. I don't hope that it's not that I know how all the circumstances will turn out, but I know the one who holds all the circumstances, who stands at the beginning, who stands at the end, who is with me through them. And it's this shift of focus from the circumstances to the one who raises the dead. And I think there's both a freedom in that, because like I said before, if you place kind of all your hope on your own ability to control it, if you say there's no God, I'll figure out how to fix it, it's all this pressure. If you say there's no God, I think the dice of chance will fall in my favor, there's all this anxiety. There's a freedom that says, I trust in the God who raises the dead. I don't know how it's all going to go, but he will bring me through. There's a lightness, but also there's this kind of full circle. It almost allows one to enter more deeply into the difficulty of our life, to recognize it more fully. Because if it all depends on us, sometimes it almost leads to kind of a denial, rejection of the hurt. But if we trust in the one who can bring us out the other side, it almost allows us a freedom to acknowledge it more fully. I think in the end, we find lament and hope tied more closely together than we realize. There's a passage in, a few weeks ago, I got to read from one of the Narnia books. I have a different one today that I want to share with you. This is from the Magician's Nephew. This idea of, as we indwell this story, our perspective shifts from circumstances to the one who raises the dead. I think there's some scenes in here that capture that for me. There's a boy in the book, Diggory, and he has been taken to the land of Narnia. But Diggory, back at home, his mother is very ill and has been ill for a long time, and he's very worried about his mother. And he brings this worry to Narnia, and actually he wants to talk to Aslan about it. And so we're going to pick up with this interaction with Aslan. And as I read a few excerpts, I want you to notice where Diggory's focus is on. It says, Diggory slipped off the horse and found himself face to face with Aslan. And Aslan was bigger and more beautiful and more brightly golden and more terrible than he had thought. He dared not look into the great eyes. "Please, Mr. Lion, Aslan, sir," said Diggory, may I, please, will you give me some magic fruit of this country to make mother well?" He had been desperately longing that the lion would say yes. He had been horribly afraid it might say no. But he was taken aback when it did neither. What ends up happening is that Diggory had brought this evil witch to the land of Narnia. And Aslan sent Diggory on a quest to actually prevent this evil witch from harming the land of Narnia. And so Diggory completes the quest, comes back, and then Aslan says, "I will give you some fruit to take to your mother." And then as Aslan is sending Diggory back to his home world, these are the words to describe him being sent back. And listen again to where his focus is. "But both the children were looking up into the lion's face as he spoke these words. And all at once, they never knew exactly how it happened. The face seemed to be a sea of tossing gold in which they were floating. And such a sweetness and power rolled about them and over them and entered into them that they felt they had never really been happy or wise or good or even alive and awake before. And the memory of that moment stayed with them always, so that as long as they both lived, if ever they were sad or afraid or angry, the thought of all that golden goodness and the feeling that it was still there, quite close, just round some corner or just behind some door, would come back and make them sure deep down inside that all was well." And the last line that I want to read, Diggory goes and he gives his mom the fruit, and he still doesn't know how it's going to turn out. But there's this line that captures this idea of focus for me, because it says, "For the rest of that day, whenever he looked at the things about him and saw how ordinary and unmagical they were, he hardly dared to hope. But whenever he remembered the face of Aslan, he did hope." And I believe for me, it captures this idea that there's something that can shift as we indwell the biblical story, that on the screen of our minds, our circumstances can get smaller. And the reality of the God that we hope in and trusting in the one who will be with us no matter what gets bigger. The way I want to end this morning is we're going to sing a Christmas song, "Come Thou Long Expected Jesus." And the reason we're going to sing this song is it's one of these things that, when we talk about this idea of closing the gap between how we perceive Christmas and the reality of our lives, for me this song is helpful because maybe at first it just feels like a happy Christmas carol, "Come Thou Long Expected Jesus." But "Come Thou Long Expected Jesus," it was written by a man named Charles Wesley in the 1740s in England. And Charles Wesley looked around at that time, and he looked around at the world, and he saw the slave trade continuing, and he saw an orphan crisis in England, and he regularly did ministry with day laborers, the lower class in England. He saw rampant poverty and this great chasm between the lower classes and the elites in the land. And it was out of this situation, kind of the painful reality of the world around him, that he wrote the words to the song, "Come Thou Long Expected Jesus." And for him, it was a prayer: Jesus, enter in, break into the world here and now. Through your people and your kingdom communities, come here now. And Jesus, I hope for the day when you come and will make all things well at the end. And so for Wesley, it didn't drive him away from the first arrival of Jesus and the second, because Wesley understood Jesus arrived in human history precisely because of sin, wickedness in the human heart, precisely because of the way sin can tear at the fabric of families, precisely the way, because that in human societies, sin builds up a head of steam and it can lead to oppression of the poor and the foreigner and the orphan, precisely because that Jesus came. And it was precisely because we long for Jesus' arrival again, because of these things, these painful realities of the way cancer takes people too soon, of the way that racism continues in our world, of the way that there are these addictions, the way like these addictions can get their talons into us, and we just wonder, when will I be free of this? And Wesley recognizes that there is this longing in the human heart for Jesus to come and break into our world in human history and at the end of human history to make all things well. And Wesley draws our attention to this God. And so as we sing, I would just invite us that whatever these things are, wherever those realities in your life seem disconnected to Christmas this year, over this next song, I would invite you to hold them, to take them, and to say, Jesus, come into this place in my life. I long for you. Draw my attention to you. Draw my attention away from these circumstances. And what I think we'll find is as our hope and lament, they're like two strings in one chord, that we can bind ourselves to the one who raises the dead and place our hope on him. Let's pray together. Jesus, Jesus, you know the secret things of the heart. You know the places that we feel the gap, the places that we have trouble seeing the truth of your entry into human history and your promise to come again, and how that lands in the painful reality of our lives today. And I just ask for me and those of us in this room this morning that you would meet us in those things. Help us not to extend that gap, but help us to understand how you are our hope in the midst of it. And Jesus, just as we read about, would our vision of you grow more clear, and would it take up more of the screen of our minds? And may our anxiety about circumstances grow smaller. We open ourselves to you now. In your name, amen.
Thanks for connecting with Hillcrest Church. For more info on this and other sermons, visit us online at hcbellingham.com or join us at 9 or 11 a.m. any Sunday morning, 1400 Larrabee Ave, Bellingham, Washington.